Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. We are very honored to have an outstanding guest today, Dr. Channa Prakash, who blogs as Ag Bio World. Good morning, Channa. Today we're going to talk with you about the food crisis in Sri Lanka, and we're interested in if we have any indication of what the cause of this crisis is and maybe what kind of resolution we could see, as well as going into your expertise in farming and farm productivity. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Carl. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to talking to you and the others here on the panel.
Great. So why don't you give us your view of exactly what happened here? I understand there's a little bit of a problem with the prime minister and nepotism, and they decided to promote within their family for monitoring and maintaining their agricultural system. And what mistakes do you think were made?
Well, Sri Lanka is really a basket case of how not to do agriculture policy and a whole host of economic policy mistakes that they made. Rajapaksa and family has been ruling Sri Lanka for quite some time now. And Rajapaksa, the just resigned Gotabaya Rajapaksa, was a defense minister during the time when they brutally cracked down on the Tamil separatists. And when his brother was the president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and that ended the 30-year civil war. And because of that, the both brothers have been extraordinarily popular, and they were elected with an overwhelming majority. And as you rightly said, there's a lot of nepotism in the country. In fact, it looks like half of the ministry were with the Rajapaksa families, and a lot of very important positions in Sri Lanka were held by these members of this clan. But now, what precipitated the economic chaos and the downfall of the Rajapaksa government that we just saw in the last few days is due to a host of factors. Sri Lanka is a country that is dependent on tourism and agriculture. And the COVID more or less ended the tourism for the last 2 years. It's a beautiful country. I have traveled across Sri Lanka, and it looks really like a tropical paradise. And next to tourism, agriculture is one of the most important revenue generators for Sri Lanka, as they get, I think they earn about $1.25 billion in tea, and they also produce 80% of the world's cinnamon. And they've also been exporting rice, amongst other things. And so Sri Lanka is probably one of the more prosperous countries in South Asia. It was richer than any of the other countries, including India, in the past few years in terms of the per capita income. And so Sri Lanka was heralded as a country that would be the next Singapore in Asia. But the civil war with the Tamil separatists put an end to that. But even after that, when Sri Lanka started recovering in the last 2 years, what really happened was, like I mentioned, a host of factors. The government mismanaged the economy in multiple ways. And I think that the turning factor was when in April of 2021, the president, Rajapaksa, said that the country is going to switch to completely organic farming. Sri Lanka spends about $400 million to import fertilizers that were very critical to the farming sector. And so based on the advice of probably a narrow group of people, primarily in what I would say are ideologues who are promoting this kind of organic and natural farming around the world, he listened to that group of people and thought that Sri Lanka could get away by saving money on the importing of fertilizers and pesticides, and then mandated that the whole country would switch to organic in the April of last year. And since then, there has been 20 to 30% crop losses because the farmers were not able to use fertilizer. And then apparently they imported some organic fertilizer from China that was found to be contaminated, because much of that was probably not well processed. And anyway, that really followed the big downturn that we see, and people didn't have much to eat, and they didn't have the cooking gas because Sri Lanka really didn't have any money to pay for anything. In fact, India was supplying the gasoline to Sri Lanka, amongst other things. So anyway, it just got worse and worse every day, and it just took a serious turn in the last week when, as you very well know, and most of the people saw on their TV around the world, that almost 100,000 people gathered near the house of the president of Sri Lanka and just simply occupied the presidential palace. And then he just simply fled the country, went to Maldives and then to Singapore, and then tendered his resignation.
So I'm interested in explaining some of these ideas and terms for our audience. When you say they wanted to switch to organic farming, what were the primary policies? Was it about the source of the fertilizer being from fossil fuels, or in other words, synthetic urea fertilizer? And what other policies accompanied that shift?
The main criticism against fertilizers was that the misuse of fertilizer that has happened in Sri Lanka and many of the developing countries since the advent of Green Revolution. And so there is a very large perception that there's been a rampant use of fertilizers in this country, and that has led to a very large environmental damage, and that food is being poisoned because of the use of fertilizers and pesticides. And so because of that thinking, that is primarily what was the PR part of it. But I think what literally drove him to do was the monetary part of it, that Sri Lanka did not have much money because of the loss in income from the loss of the tourism industry because of COVID. And so they just thought that this is one thing they could just cut use of it. But in actual fact, as it was explained by one Mr. Gupta, Shekhar Gupta, in the print magazine and in his podcast, when you're a dictator, not many people around you will tell you what's wrong with some of your policies. So I don't think anybody, there was quite a visible, strong letters to the editor and commentary by agricultural scientists that you just can't do it. If, there are several ways, there are several scientific ways to cut down the use of fertilizers and pesticides. And many countries have followed that and have reduced the use of fertilizer if that is what is bothering you. But he just didn't really listen, and he just moved forward and canceled that. And that really created the big ag farming chaos.
So as I've noted for our chat, you are a professor of plant molecular genetics at Tuskegee University. So what can you tell us about these plans that Sri Lanka could have taken in order to sort of minimize fertilizer use, so minimize the financial impact with proper application of technology?
Right. One important is the policy. Fertilizer was subsidized. It was practically given at a very throwaway rate to the farmers, and that led to its misuse. And so, when you make anything free, like we have seen with water, for instance, in most countries, it tends to be a lot of wastage and misuse. And when there's really not much ownership of that. And that was one, I think, was the primary cause of the fertilizer misuse, or probably overuse of fertilizer in some places. But secondly, the fertilizer, as we are talking about, are really the first generation of fertilizers. Today, many of the fertilizers that are being used, especially in the developed world, like here in the US, are more second and third generation fertilizers. They are more slow release fertilizer in a way that you don't have to apply as much fertilizer. And then we also have what we call as precision agriculture being practiced here in the US and many other countries, where we tend to have a lot more information on the fertility levels of your farm and then only apply how much is needed. You see, 80% of the fertilizers that we apply routinely gets lost. And if we tailor the fertilizer application to the nutrient needs of the soil, then we really will make sure that there is not as much loss. But there also are many other practices, integrated farming, where we incorporate cereals plus the grain legumes, which fix nitrogen is one of the way. Probably would have cereals that fix nitrogen, so we don't have to put any nitrogen at all, just like we don't put any much nitrogen to grain legumes like soybeans and chickpea. And also developing disease-resistant and pest-resistant crops would also reduce or even eliminate the use of pesticides and fungicides, for instance. I think that science-based approach is a better way to go to make your farming more environmentally friendly and more sustainable.
So a lot of the criticism that folks have about these advanced technologies is that they're a cash grab, they're greedy corporations. And where do you see in actual application of these technologies, where are the technologies, and especially which technologies are being delivered as unencumbered tech, like no patent tech or open source tech that is open to the world? I know several folks that I've spoken with at Washington State University, where I was connected to their crop and soils department. There are some people who went back to their native countries and used the things that they learned in America in order to help their own people and help promote modern agriculture without necessarily seeking profits off of these developing nations.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a concern which in some ways has some legitimacy, but my worry is that most of these companies that are leaders in the development of biotechnology, they really have not much interest in investing in the developing world. You know, many of the poor countries where food is a problem, these corporations are not going to be setting up shops over there because there's not much money to be made. But I believe the public sector and the international agricultural centers that are increasingly being funded by Bill Gates, for instance, has a very important role to bring this technology into the developing world. A good case in point is the golden rice that was invented in Switzerland, but was transferred with patent or royalty free for developing country farmers to Philippines, where they have developed and released this golden rice. And they didn't have to pay any technology fees or the royalties for the technology developers because they wrote off their hold on the royalties and the patents for the use of these technologies in the developing world. Similarly, there is a foundation called Africa Agriculture Technology Foundation, which acts as a middleman for bringing many of these technologies that were developed in the West and that are under patent control, and then bringing it to the African farmers. So at this moment, it is not the patents and the royalties that are preventing the application of biotechnology into the developing world. What is really coming in the way of bringing this technology to the developing world is really the very strong opposition to this technology that has been shown through many of these European NGOs that are operating in these countries that have become a very big stumbling block. And they have spread a lot of myths and misinformation against biotechnology in many of these countries. And so much so that even many of the educated, intelligent people in this country think that these crops and these foods are dangerous. And policymakers in many of these countries do not want to stick their neck out for something that has become very controversial, when in actual reality, there is not much safety concerns. We've been eating these products for the last 30 years. There's not been a single instance of harm to anybody or to the environment so far.
Yeah, I'm. In fact, this was something that I explored in the late 90s, is the idea that, the pig gene that's being spliced into the crops is going to infect you and turn you into, and it's utterly ridiculous. And as eco-modernists, we are of course in favor of the correct application of technology. And it's not like food has been safe and perfect simply because it hasn't been gene edited. There's the very famous case of the Lenape potato, where we bred and we crossbred potatoes for better application in potato chips, but it caused a poisonous food product, and that was before gene editing. So
exactly,
yeah. But the idea that NGOs have taken up some kind of ideology and some narrative that the public is accepting as nature is best, and we have to have a natural food product and a whole, holistic, organic food product, is a very strong marketing message. What is the reality of this? What kind of overlap of certified organic products and technology is possible? And where does this certified organic in the US sort of get in the way of better agriculture?
Well, I think, organic products, like with any other product, has a place in our society. If there are individuals who don't mind paying a little bit more for their organic tomatoes, should be able to buy them. But what is really happening is that, when you just go to the street in Seattle where you are and just ask, do you want to buy food without any pesticides or fertilizers, everybody will say yes. But when they go to the store and they see an organic tomato cost $2 a pound, or the regular tomatoes cost $1 a pound, they almost always go for the $1 a pound tomatoes. And that's so much so that organic food, organic crops are grown in less than 3% of the farmlands here in the United States, and maybe about 5 or 6% in Europe, even where organic is, supposedly a big deal. What the problem comes is that when the organic industry wages war on the conventional food and the foods developed through biotechnology, trying to portray this as something evil, something that is manipulated for greed, something that's not been tested and maybe dangerous, and just as a way to drive the customers to their product. And I think that has caused a lot of damage here in the United States and in Europe, and is causing a major stumbling block in the further progress of this technology.
I guess the summary that we have so far for the program is the green NGOs are not always productive and respective of the needs of farmers. And in fact, in Sri Lanka, this created the popular culture that influenced this corrupt dictatorship in order to have a simple flat ban on artificial synthetic fertilizers, which has caused a great decrease in the output of the farms. The rice production went down by at least 20%. And then that on top of the already strained finances of Sri Lanka, because they had no tourism because of COVID, it simply collapsed the whole house of cards.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's very, very important. There is such a negative perception on the use of fertilizers and pesticides. If there are some egregious examples of misuse of them, we need to correct that. It doesn't mean that we just ban this, because if you really research and trying to understand some of the greatest innovations that have contributed to the increase in the longevity of human population, for instance, and even increase in the quality of living, fertilizers rank number one in all of these innovations, even more than vaccines and antibiotics, simply because they help improve our population, cut down infant mortality rate. So many host of ways that fertilizers and even pesticides have contributed. And I'm quite confident that there's been a tremendous increase in the innovation and the technology in the agriculture sector in the past 20 years. And if we use it wisely, we will be able to feed this increasing population. It's going to be 8 or 9 billion. And not only feed them well, but also do it in a manner that we are not going to be causing degradation of our natural environment, like we have done to a certain extent in the past 30 or 40 years through green revolution and our need to increase food production at any cost.
Mhm. And the Gapminder Institute has some really good data about this. And this is the modernization of human populations, where we go from having 6 to 8 children in a woman's life to having 2, because previously 75% or so would not survive to adulthood. And this is the question of survival, is how do you survive into the old age? You have more children to care for you, or you have children who are grown adults to care for you before you die. And so this is the number one question is, can we as a family unit continue to survive? And as we bring in more technology to the families, we see population gradually flatline. It is no longer exponentially increasing. And this is the story of population around the globe. So no matter what you think the cause of environmental damage is, we can see that the proper application of modernization and technology does improve the course of humanity. So was there an improvement in the Sri Lankan lifestyle before 2020?
Absolutely. When they ended the civil war in 2011, 2012, and the ensuing 8 years after that, there was a tremendous growth in Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka was almost like a middle-income country, comparable to Malaysia, for instance. And definitely better than many of its neighbors, including India in South Asia. But the COVID, along with some of the really bad economic policies, precipitated all the damage that we see there in that country today.
Wonderful. And so I almost wonder, is the harm that we've seen in Sri Lanka a preview of what could happen around the world if we see a sudden drop in fertilizer supply? And if that drop is continued for a much longer period of time, is that one of the causes of inflation at the moment, or could it exacerbate that inflation?
Absolutely. I think it'll contribute to that. And we already see now with the war in Ukraine perpetrated by Russia, because Ukraine and Russia, they are a very important source of both potash and phosphate fertilizers. And because they also export petroleum, which is used in the production of nitrogen fertilizer, the cost of all the 3 fertilizers has increased. And also we saw Ukraine and Russia are big grain exporter too. And now not having that grain export is really contributed a lot, so much so that today President Biden, who's in Middle East, announced $1 billion in food aid to the Middle Eastern countries. Because if you see a country like Egypt, for instance, was importing 70-80% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and now it's not able to do that. And the bread prices has increased in many of these countries. So they're all interrelated. And if anything that affects food production is going to reverberate across not only that country, but in many other countries. Unlike a lot of other commodities, the food world almost always has a very short window of supply of the food, and it needs to be continuously be grown and processed and then distributed. And anything that affects that, whether the productivity of our farming or the distribution that we saw from some of the supply chain issues, for instance, all of them will have a broad range of ramifications around the world. And remember, even in 2011, it is the cost of the bread increase that caused the Arab Spring and that brought the governments in Tunisia and Egypt and other places. So people will put up with a lot of other problems. And the same thing in Sri Lanka, as somebody pointed out, they've been going to IMF for financial aid. So COVID hit all the countries in the world. But what broke the back of the camel in Sri Lanka was really the very hasty decision that simply just put a death knell to their agriculture.
Yeah, we often hear in the environmental side of our debates that, it is just a matter of our will to change our financial system or our will to change our energy systems, and it's only because of greed that we haven't done this. But that's not true. We've seen in Germany where the shutting of nuclear has led to destabilization of their energy supplies. They became dependent on Russia for gas, and as a result, now they are burning more coal. Their emissions are worse than they have been in a decade, unfortunately. And it's sort of this misapplication of what we think are virtuous actions. We go whole hog into what the popular answer is, and it results in disaster. So I want to thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks everyone for watching, and thanks everyone in chat and on the Zoom for bringing your ideas to us today. This is the Ecomodernist Society of North America, the Ecomodernist channel live. We are live on Facebook, Trovo, DLive, FC2, and Twitch and Twitter. So you can find us usually under the Ecomodernist channel or Ecomodernist Society of North America. But here on Twitch, I am Soyaddle. This is my political commentary channel. I soy with you as you soy at me. We talk about all politics and outrage, but mostly we bring you this program every Saturday, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, where we talk with other ecomodernists and other pro-science environmentalists and pro-science contributors. Thanks so much for watching.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.